So this continues the reading of Chapter 4 in the book Transactionalism by Trevor J. Phillips. The Nature of Man, Transactional Assumptions. The stimulus response concept rejected. Learning, Thorndike maintained, is connecting, and stimulus and response are, in principle, distinguished in order that their connection may be achieved. From their earliest criticism of associationism, transactionalists have emphasized the organic relation between stimulus and response, denying that they could, in fact, be sharply distinguished. They have further seriously questioned the validity of the entire reflex arc concept which underlay associationist theory. For associationists, the arc was a process consisting of three independent and discrete existences: the sensory stimulus, the psychical reception, and the motor response. The psychical reception is an in-between, a central phase which could, at times, be very elaborate. An interval occupied by the thinking processes necessary to gain clearance for the appropriate impulse. The reflex arc concept is based on the notion that nothing occurs without first a stimulus from the sensory side. The circuit or arc must repeatedly begin with sensation and end with a motor reaction. Transactionalists were to point out that all experience, if this interpretation were to be accepted, is merely an unrelated series of arcs, wherein future consequences can have no bearing on the meaning of the original phenomenon. The first of the modern transactional psychologists, John Dewey, was to bring a convincing refutation to bear on this widely held theory. Perhaps the most famous and pregnant of Dewey's psychological works was his essay which appeared just 70 years ago in the Psychological Review. In it, he made two highly significant assertions. First, he maintained that behaviors were to be treated as directly subjects of research in their own right, not as mental or psychological, not, that is, as hypostatizations. Secondly, he held that what had hitherto been called stimulus and reaction or response were, when isolated, truncated part statements. As will be made clear, Dewey saw stimulus and response as phases of a complete event rather than its factors. The standard interpretation placed upon the stimulus-response linkage and its relation to the cause-effect bond at the end of the 19th century was, for Dewey, highly unsatisfactory. He maintained that the older dualism, which the reflex arc concept had allegedly replaced, the dualism between sensation and idea, body and mind, was now being perpetuated in the guise of peripheral and central structures and functions. In effect, the twin, though distinct worlds of body and soul could find their counterparts in the then current dualism of stimulus and response. Dewey contended that the arc, composed as it was of the sensory stimulus, central activity, and motor discharge, could not conceivably be regarded as an organic unity, but rather as a patchwork of disjointed parts, a mechanical conjunction of unallied process. Required was a surrendering of the view that these three elements of the arc were indeed separate and discrete entities, and a substituting of the notion of division of labor, functioning factors, within the single concrete whole, the arc, or more precisely, the circuit itself. Far from being the unit of behavior professed by its proponents, the mechanism of reflexes is evolved as a specialized differentiation within an inclusive whole of behavior. To illustrate his premises, Dewey selected the child candle sequence. The ordinary interpretation would say the sensation of light is a stimulus to the grasping as a response. The burn resulting is a stimulus to withdrawing the hand as a response, and so on. Dewey saw several defects in this idea. In the first place, there was the assumption that sensory stimulus and motor response are separate mental entities, whereas they are always inside a coordination and have their significance purely from the part played in maintaining or reconstituting the coordination. There was also, thought Dewey, the failure to view the arc as a circuit, as a continual reconstitution, to see instead a series of jerks, whose origin is sought outside of the process of experience itself. Dewey's summation was definitive. What he argued against was a mechanistic interpretation of the SR linkage and advocated a unified approach. His choice of the word coordination attested to this. No mere sensation could by and of itself be either stimulus or response. Required is a coordination, a total act, a circuit rather than an arc. For it is within such a coordination that the organism undergoing the experience contributes to the nature and quality of the act just as effectively as does the environment. It is the significance of this coordination and not the intricacies of the reflex arc itself which is pertinent to the present study. Dewey here laid the groundwork for his later research in the field of interaction and later still transaction. The germ of these processes can be identified in his earlier writings. There is a very obvious and direct connection between the declaration in his final major work to the effect that each person is a party whose being and actions cannot possibly be understood apart from the fact of participation in the process of living, and his earlier references to the total act, or coordination, within which transactions occur. The idea of coordination was not only integral to Dewey's criticism of the stimulus-response concept, it further served as the foundation of what was destined to become one of his key terms, situation. Whereas in 1896, coordination was used to designate the single concrete whole, in 1938, situation was described as a contextual whole. Dewey's essay, Conduct and Experience, which originally appeared in 1930, is significant for the fact that it contains the first specific reference by Dewey to his particular concept of interaction as transaction, and also for its restatement of the view that organism and environment are not to be held in sharp severance, but must be seen as falling together within a common situation out of which they may be differentiated by analysis. It is not possible, said Dewey, for an organism to be so isolated that it can be understood apart from its environment. Sensory receptors and muscular effectors, the eye and the hand, have their existence as well as their meaning because of connections with an outer environment. The following paragraph augured a new era in philosophical and psychological circles. The structure of whatever is had by way of immediate qualitative presences is found in the recurrent modes of interaction taking place between what we term organism on one side and environment on the other. This interaction is the primary fact, and it constitutes a transaction. Only by analysis and selective abstraction can we differentiate the actual occurrence into two factors, one called organism and the other environment. This fact militates strongly against any form of behaviorism that defines behavior in terms of the nervous system or body alone. A crucial omission of the associationist school pointed to by Dewey was the failure to ascertain how an object acquired the capacity to be a stimulus. Clearly, to regard every condition in the vicinity of the organism as a stimulus is to say that the entire universe is both stimulus and response, and is to render any attempt at analysis worthless. On the other hand, that which makes some physical thing or trait a stimulus is the condition of the whole organism at the time. Its needs, and the kind of behavior in which it is already engaged. Within the SR theory, the environment is severed from the behavior of the organism, which becomes an external occasion from which behavior proceeds. That is, behavior is seen, according to many associationists, as that which goes on within the organism and is simply set off or initiated by the environment. Actually, argued Dewey, the latter is as integral a part of behavior as are organic processes, and behavior is something going on in a surrounding medium, a continuous interaction in which environing as well as organic factors are included. There is then no organism that can be defined apart from the situation in which it finds itself, and no environment defined apart from the organism. Further, the interactions referred to are not themselves isolated, but form a temporal continuity. Dewey was emphatic when he wrote of the durational point of view. Echoing Peirce, he proclaimed that behavior is serial, not mere succession. He granted that such behavior could be resolved into individual acts, but no act can be understood apart from the series to which it belongs. In any experiment, for example, there is to be found within the context that constitutes and includes the multifarious ongoing interactions, something which goes beyond the actual stimuli and responses. There is the problem set by the experimenter, his deliberate arrangement of apparatus and selection of conditions, and intent or purpose on the part of a subject engaged in the experiment. Thus, a definite characteristic of behavior is pointed to. It is not exhausted in the immediate SR features of the experiment. Also, from the standpoint of behavior itself, the traits in question, problem, selective arrangement, intent, take us beyond the isolated act of the subject into a content that has temporal spread. The acts in question came out of something and move into something else. Their whole scientific point is lost unless they are placed as one phase of this contextual behavior. A stimulus then becomes a function, in the mathematical sense of variable quantity, of behavior in its serial character. It is born when something outside of the organism interrupts an ongoing activity and becomes a stimulus. In virtue of the relations it sustains to what is going on in the continuing activity. No external change is a stimulus in and of itself. It becomes the stimulus in virtue of what the organism is already preoccupied with. To call it, to think of it, as a stimulus without taking into account the behavior that is already going on is so arbitrary as to be nonsensical. We do not experience, asserted Dewey, nor do we form judgments about objects and events in isolation, but only in connection with the contextual whole, situation. With Mead, he maintained that always do we find an object or event as a special part, phase, or aspect of an environing, experienced whole, a situation. Psychology has been remiss in its insistence upon a singular object or event as suitable matter for its analysis. Even when it is granted that the individual object is conspicuous by virtue of its particular focal and crucial position at a given time. There is always a field in which observation of this or that object or event occurs. In 1938, Dewey published his Experience and Education, and was even more explicit on the matter of situation and interaction. The word interaction assigns equal rights to both factors in experience, objective and internal conditions. Taken together or in their interaction, they form what we call a situation. The statement that individuals live in a world means that they live in a series of situations. And when it is said that they live in these situations, the meaning of the word in is different from its meaning when it is said that pennies are in a pocket. It means that interaction is going on between an individual and objects and other persons. The conceptions of situation and of interaction are inseparable from each other. An experience is always what it is because of a transaction taking place between an individual and what at the time constitutes his environment. This further distinction which Dewey drew between interaction and transaction is of particular interest. The situation or context of an experience is composed of the interaction of external and internal factors. The dynamic energies existing between these two phases comprise the transaction and are responsible for the quality of that experience. In his Logic, also published in 1938, Dewey wrote of transaction in connection with his concept of situation. For him, organic life was engaged in a process of activity involving an environment, a transaction extending beyond the spatial limits of the organism, which does not live in an environment. It lives by means of an environment. The processes of living are enacted by the environment as truly as by the organism, for they are an integration. Dewey's denial, then, that behavior is a succession of isolated and independent units of excitation-reaction is replaced by the assertion that it is a function of the total state of the organism in the latter's relation to its environment.